Hey guys, welcome to Noetic and our continuing exploration of the works of Soren Kierkegaard. Today we will be covering 3 Upbuilding Discourses from 1843. My guests today are...
I'm CJ, hello.
I'm Matt.
And the reason why we chose this particular work, 3 Upbuilding Discourses, is that with Jordan Klein I was able to cover Fear and Trembling, and with CJ we were able to do Repetition. And what a lot of people don't know is there are these neglected Upbuilding Discourses, which we're going to discuss today, that were dropped on the same day as those other 2 works. And I think what we're going to try to figure out is what Kierkegaard is saying in this work and how it maybe overlaps with some of his intentionality in Fear and Trembling and in Repetition. So I have some background information prepared, but I don't know. Is there anything else anybody else wants to say before we launch into it?
Go for it.
I will have to say that this was personally motivated out of tremendous respect for a guy who does a lot of internet curation of Soren Kierkegaard, Craig Campbell. I think he requested this. So if we are the Casey Kasem of Kierkegaard, this one goes out to you, Craig. So let me do a bit of a historical background here. I mentioned already. So it's part of the 18 Upbuilding Discourses, and you may know Matt. You may know something about how all the Upbuilding Discourses got assembled together. But Kierkegaard actually did this in 5 installments. They did 2 Upbuilding Discourses in 1843, the 3 that we're doing today, 4 in 1843, 2 in 1844, 3 in 1844, and 4 in 1844, and they were all written between the periods of between the time of 1843 and 1845. These are all direct signings, and because they occur so early in the Kierkegaard authorship, it is to show the authorial intention of Soren Kierkegaard, that he was writing explicitly philosophically or pseudonymously in the first authorship, that it was, is the correct word to say what's the word there? Polyonymous? Or something to that effect. That for every means of indirect communication, there was also a direct signing that went along with it, which is something I didn't really understand. I believe the 2 Upbuilding Discourses were published at the same time as either or. And I believe the 3 Upbuilding Discourses were, like I said earlier, published in regards to Repetition and Fear and Trembling. So it's to get this clearer picture that Kierkegaard was a religious author from the start. He didn't sort of evolve. He didn't start off as an aesthete and then an ethical and then a religious person. There was a plan from the beginning that he details pretty explicitly in My Point of View as an Author, which is a book I hope we take up at some point, and maybe there will be time to do that. But what's interesting about this is a direct signing, unlike Repetition, which was supposedly written by, how do you say his name? How do you say CC's name?
Is it Constantinius or something?
Yeah. And Fear and Trembling was written by Johann de Silencio. This is going to be a direct signing, meaning that we can sort of understand this to be more theological in nature and probably closer to Kierkegaard's actual view. So, without further ado, I think we should just kind of jump into it. What I thought was interesting in the preface is that Kierkegaard doesn't call these 3 Upbuilding Discourses sermons, right? So he opts for the word discourse over sermon because he doesn't feel like he holds the proper post or the authority to be sermonizing. But it's a discourse. I think it's kind of interesting just to take a second. What is the difference between, say, the philosophical works and a discourse? How do you understand that, Matt?
Well, for the discourses, I think of it, you've kind of already said it. It's more direct. It's more explicitly religious. It fulfills the same task as a sermon, but without the authority of actually being a minister or a preacher in the Danish church or any church.
I think there's a qualitative distinction, though. CJ, do you know what I'm getting at here?
Well, to me, it seems like I could just hear this being spoken, or at least there's a quality in which it's not necessarily to be read, but I could hear this at a church or Danish church or something like that. To me, a lot of repetition and a lot of analogies. It works really well as, I think, if it could become an audiobook or something like that, I would love to hear it.
Well, interesting. I think it's meant to be read out loud.
Okay.
Yeah. And I have a ton of quotes, so we'll probably give people...
We'll be reading out loud.
Yeah, we'll probably give people a lot of flavor of it. I think the main distinction between a discourse and some of the more philosophical things is that the discourse is kind of, it's softer. I think it's supposed to lead to this inward strengthening, to sort of nourish the spirit and the soul, whereas the philosophical stuff is, I don't know, more offensive, more abrasive in a way. I can't remember where it was, if it was in Repetition or Fear and Trembling or something like that, where Kierkegaard says that God issues these commands, but then he sort of cloaks it in allegories and metaphors so people that understand. I believe it was the lilies of the field, birds of the air. It's like that everybody understands thou shalt love or obey God or be joyful in life or whatever, but Christ has to do the Sermon on the Mount so that individuals can have this, it can be softened so they they're more ready to receive it than just sort of philosophical argumentation. So I think that's kind of the difference between, say, a discourse and a sermon and some of the more philosophical stuff.
Do you think it makes it more easier? Because I feel like what we're going to read is, to me, was so heavy, and I just kind of can think like, okay, it's an easy, simple sort of thing to say, like, okay, love is this, or, strengthen your inner being that way, but just to do it and to confront it would seem to be monumental task.
It's deceptive, because on one hand there's going to be a lot of flowery language, but at the same time what it's going to demand of us is like utterly shocking. So it only in a certain sense is it going to be softer and easier, but it's actually going to be potentially more rigid and harsher than the other stuff that's in the more philosophical pseudonymous works.
So it's a spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down, I suppose.
I suppose so. I mean, what would you say in regards to that particular issue, Matt?
As far as the discourses go?
Yeah.
You're saying the discourses are the sugar to help it go down?
Oh, maybe that's the wrong analogy. Or what do you think? Maybe they're just the medicine. Maybe it's just what...
I mean, I would have thought that the indirect pseudonyms are the sugar to make the medicine go down. Because it is indirect, but... and it's meant to guide people there and not have them think about it. It's kind of like those philosophy and pop culture books. It's meant to be sort of, you're not just saying philosophy, you're cloaking philosophy to help it go down a little bit.
So then the discourses maybe then are the medicine, I suppose, if somebody got into it with either or whatever, and then, okay, let me actually be serious about the religious life, then they would read the Upbuilding Discourses, perhaps.
See, I typically think about the pseudonymous works as more like a Trojan horse, right? In the sense that like Kierkegaard's got ulterior motives with it, and then like he's going to spring out and he's going to catch you off guard. Whereas I tend to think about this discourses stuff as kind of like it's already sort of appealing to people who are sympathetic to the Christian message. You know what I'm saying? So he's not. I don't know if he's necessarily going into enemy territory with the discourses. Like I think it's about sort of nourishing the flock that's already there. That's why I think But we're mixing all sorts of metaphors.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that in either authorship and either pseudonymous or direct signing, there are different types of medicine and different types of sugar.
Yeah.
So you could make this happen in so many different ways.
Well, and looking at the second authorship too, like he gets very polemic with his other direct writings in the later authorship, which in some ways would seem to be like you almost want the medicine, the sugary medicine of the first authorship at that point, because then he's just like, yeah, the Danish church is a fraud. You know what I mean? Like
it gets more bitter. Yeah, bitter medicine.
Yeah, I've seen some individuals actually exclude those writings from like 1851 to 1855 and put that into a different category that goes beyond the second authorship. Some people have divided that into like the attack on Christendom or whatever. So it's like not really quite right to say that it keeps the same tenor as the second authorship. We're getting into the weeds, so should get into the text. But so the first discourse. I believe the first and second discourse are entitled the same thing, are they not?
Yes.
It's called Love Will Hide a Multitude of Sins. And this is coming from 1 Peter chapters 4, verses 7 through 12. And for those of you who are listening on the app or whatever, I have read these particular passages from the Bible and put it into the cache so you can have the particular reference. But there is one line in 1 Peter chapter 4, 7 through 12 about love hiding the multitude of sins. And Kierkegaard's going to sort of elaborate on precisely what that means. So the question is, what makes a man great, pleasing to God, soft, constant? And Kierkegaard is going to say, well, that it's going to be love. But then he also considers, well, the pagans had love, and they extolled love. They knew everything about love. I mean, there's Plato's symposium where they're talking all about love. But he thinks that the pagans had an inferior conception of love. They didn't know the heavenly love, the Christian love. And I guess something that goes on here in this first discourse from the 3 Upbuilding Discourses of 1843 is trying to understand the distinction between pagan and Christian love. And so I'll cede the floor. How do you guys understand the difference between pagan and Christian love going on here? I mean, what's the main thing he says about pagan love? It has some imitation of the divine, does it not?
So there's this comment here at the bottom of, which page is this? 55, where he says, "For the pagan, love was beautiful, more beautiful than anything, but revenge was sweet.
Yes.
Sweeter than everything." So this is where he starts to talk about how inferior the pagan's thinking about love is. And it's interesting, and we were talking earlier before we recorded about the place that the pagan plays in Kierkegaard's understanding of religion.
Yeah.
As does the Jew, and there are some obvious... I think there have been some different books written about how Kierkegaard is a little anti-Semitic. And
Do you think he is?
Well, it's hard because anti-Semitic, a little misogynistic when you read certain text.
I can understand the misogynistic aspect given his spurned love affair, but I for me to see the anti-Semitism in it would... So far, I haven't encountered strong anti-Semitism in Kierkegaard.
I guess it depends on, whenever you talk about distinctions between the Christian and Christians setting themselves up as superior to the Jew, like the Jew was here, but then the Christian came. Like, it's hard for and I think in some ways it's hard for the Christian not to say that because they do think Jesus fulfills the Hebrew scriptures. Like, it's hard, like that dialogue is a hard one to navigate, but Kierkegaard's not interested in that dialogue. But he is in a century. I mean, historically, Christian Europe was anti-Semitic. The Jews were persecuted. So I think we can't dismiss the charge of anti-Semitism. Lightly.
It strikes me as a little odd because he obviously looks to heroes of the Jewish faith, right? I mean, Job. I mean, would we wrong to say that Job is Jewish, right?
Yeah, Job.
Job is Jewish. It's harder to say what Abraham is. Because Abraham,
he's the father
of
Abrahamic
Judaism and Christianity, and indirectly Islam as well.
And again, I don't think we want to get bogged down in the anti-Semitism issue so much as just to acknowledge it as we move forward to point out like the problem of the pagan, the Jew, and the Christian.
And he does commend the Jews, at least in the sense that he says, I guess in one part, he says, even though he left revenge to the Lord, which he considers a good thing, his soul still was not unfamiliar with its sweetness. So even though we leave revenge to the Lord, but there's still this attitude of having enemies. And
for who again?
I mean, I think it's for the Jew, for like Jewish love. Yeah.
But it would also be for the pagan as well. It's not really so much this would be for anyone outside of the Christian revelation. To say that Kierkegaard is an anti-Semite, you'd have to say that he's anti-pagan. But he's definitely not anti-pagan because he's in love with Socrates.
Well, again, the issue here... But Socrates for Kierkegaard represents this like post-pagan or like this like in between
proto-Christian.
Yeah, like this in between. So that's so again, like without getting too bogged down in the anti-Semitism issue, while also acknowledging that there might be problems and there's plenty of literature on the discussion. For the pagan, Jew, and the Christian, there's an interesting book that I think just came out by George Connell, Kierkegaard and the Paradox of Religious Diversity, and Connell talks about how these represents Kierkegaard's, and in some ways you could call it a theology of religions. Mm-hmm. So for the pagan, you could roughly maybe say that, they have no sin consciousness, no guilt consciousness, they're just immanent, and they go with the immediate and whatever.
Their love is changeable. They can love the neighbor, but then they can also enacting revenge.
Exactly, but then you have this description of the devout Jew on page 56. The devout Jew also gave witness for love, but his love was the child of changeableness and variation, and he knew how to hate his enemy. Mm-hmm. So for Kierkegaard, the Jew is...
With good reason.
Yeah.
With good reason the Jew could hate.
Well, yeah. If history has shown us anything, it's that the Jew has been the historical scapegoat in a lot of the West. But the big thing there, too, is just this idea that, for Kierkegaard, the Jew in some ways represents this transition because they participate in the promises of God, but at the same time, they're still not. It's not for Kierkegaard, the full promise of the Christian. And then the Christian comes along, and that's the one who love covers a multitude of sins, And by doing so, there's revenge is left entirely to the Lord. There's no changeableness in love to revenge.
Yeah, so let me read off some itemized stuff here. We've talked about what a non-Christian love looks like in the sense of the changeableness and leaving revenge to God or something like that. He itemizes, I believe, 5 characteristics of proper love, or what I would call Christian love. The first being that love does not become something else. It's not changeable, right? So that we are to be sort of steadfast in our love. We don't then take up revenge as sort of our telos. It demands nothing, has nothing to lose. It's not a calculation. It's just sort of like a mode of being. It blesses, and it even blesses when it's cursed. So even when when you are oppressed, it still loves the oppressor. So I think that 4 follows from that: loves neighbor and enemy. And then 5 we've already spoken about, where it leaves revenge to the Lord. That ultimately, like, we are not to be sort of enacting hate or anything like that. This will all sort of be made sensible and taken care of by God one day. So, yeah. I think we have kind of an understanding of what love looks like outside of the Christian revelation. So, the next thing here, and Matt, I might have to defer to you because I think you were a little bit more up to date on this first discourse than I was. He says, Peter says, love will hide a multitude of sins. But what does this mean? And I have a quote here from page 60 that might precipitate further discussion on this particular matter. When an appetite for sin lives in the heart, the eye discovers the multiplicity of sin and makes it even more multiple, because the eye is the lamp of the body. But if the lamp that is in a person is dark, then how great is the darkness? So, what do you think he's trying to say there?
So I really enjoy this passage. He's quoting this idea about the evil eye seeing evil.
Yeah, he goes. Yeah, there's a little. Just to continue that, he says, "When love lives in the heart, the eye is shut and does not discover the open act of sin, to say nothing of the concealed act."
Yeah, that is the interesting part about this text for me, is how he inverts the love is blind and uses it within this context, which I think you're about to talk about.
Well, yeah, there's even this other quote on 60, right under the reference to 3 John 11. Mm-hmm. A person's inner being then determines what he discovers and what he hides. And I've thought about, I was reading Zizek the other day, which is totally not relevant for this conversation necessarily, but he makes this comment about the liberal ideology of victimhood. And this will tie in maybe later to what Kierkegaard writes about adversity and not letting adversity pull you down or not change you. Like, I think it's very easy for applying it to lives I've seen, for people to become wounded and all they see, there's another quote in the second discourse. It's just, these 2 discourses relate to each other so much it's hard not to use them as a commentary, that sin discovers the multiplicity of sin. So that if your inner eye is evil, if your inner eye is wounded, if you haven't been changed inwardly by love, then all you'll see of everyone is suspicion. You'll have a suspicion that ends up seeing the evil in everybody and discovering every fault. And how that, I do this myself. Like, it's very easy, especially in church and ministry stuff, not to see everyone's fault, including your own, and not allowing love to cover a multitude of sins. So this idea of the evil eye that discovers, that isn't perfected in love. Bonhoeffer has this great section in Ethics when he opens it up about how the problem with Christian ethics is that if you talk about discovering right and wrong, it already shows that you're separated from God and from the state of being. That I think, who knows, maybe he takes it from Kierkegaard in this respect, but love is that state of being that allows your eye to see as it ought to and not discover the multiplicity of sin.
Yeah, I think you pretty accurately summed it up. If you don't have this revealed sort of love, then you find a multitude of sins within you, and then you find it with everybody else. But that's not to say that, like, love is going to be this, like, pleasurable process, right? No. Because ultimately you're going to have to reckon with what you find internally. I think you summed that up pretty nicely. What about this question about love never being deceived?
Which page?
Somewhere in that same vicinity, from page 60 to page 63.
I wonder if it has to do perhaps with the whole idea that it doesn't hear. I know Kierkegaard, I can't remember where, but he, by saying love is blind, he also said love is deaf or a little slow, that even though somebody might be yelling, if we try to embody love as a person, if somebody's yelling at love, for instance, like, just insulting him, that he doesn't fully, that love fully doesn't understand that, and that he's waiting for another sentence or two to make everything right again. So I'm wondering if it has to do maybe with the fact that it can't be deceived, it can't really be anything because it's blind and deaf. It's not really listening to anything else. It's keeping its eye on God, and therefore it has no interference with anything else.
It can't be deceived, right? It's not based on human calculation. If love merely desires the Lord, like, the only way you can be deceived is if you're trying to put your trust in people to orchestrate a plan to bring about something temporal. But it's like,
granted, in the third discourse, he's going to talk about if you have your bearings with God first, then you can love people or have trust in people. What were you going to say?
That's a beautiful passage.
Yeah.
That's actually one I thought was in Fear and Trembling and couldn't find, and then I discovered it here.
You were going to say something. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think it's this idea that, when Paul says in 1 Corinthians that love believes all things, trusts all things, it's very easy for us in our human calculation to then worry about deception. It's like, well, if we believe all things, then we might get hurt or deceived. And I think this is what he's addressing here. This like believing the best of someone and not jumping to judgment, which is what you do when you're looking for, when your eye is trained to see the multiplicity of sin in people and to not cover a multitude of sins, which again is hard to do because we get hurt by adversity, and if we don't let ourselves be trained by adversity, we just act out of. Ever since I read this thing in Zizek, the ideology of victimhood, the ideology of liberal victimhood. Yeah. Can we read passages? Is that okay?
It depends on the length. I mean, I won't get sued.
A whole page. Maybe.
I won't get sued if it's shorter. So maybe I'll cut you off at like the 8 or 9 line mark.
All right. In that case, he has this comment, bottom of 60, part of 61. When rashness lives in the heart, a person is quick to discover a multiplicity of sins. Skipping down, when love lives in the heart, a person understands slowly and does not hear at all words said in haste, and does not understand them when repeated because he assigns them a good position and a good meaning. And this is your comment. He is waiting for one more word that will give it meaning. Because when love gives, it does not watch the gift, but keeps its eye on the Lord. And it has the power to love forth the good in the impure. And it translates evil into good. So those are some different sections I've underlined from 60 to 61.
And we're going to discover in the second discourse too, where he says, but love takes everything. That, in this paradoxical sense where it takes everything, the sin, the good, the bad, but it makes all of it love in some way. And it's crazy.
That's the great thing about it, smothering the sins or whatever. And I think Matt's already sort of alluded to it, and CJ, you're echoing him. On page 63, he says, but the person who reduces sin surely hides a multitude of sins, and hides it doubly by not sinning himself and by keeping another from it. So not only does it make you blind to other people's sins and the sins within yourself, but it makes you more likely to not sin. Like, if you're so fixated on God and loving God or whatever, you're not going to engage in all the things that cause a sin within and without to begin with. So, I think that's pretty cool. That's all I have for the first discourse. Did you have anything else you wanted to include for the first discourse?
Do you have? I do have something going back to the Abraham apostle.
Sure, let's go into that, because I was just going to talk about the final Bible passage he sort of quotes at the end, where he talks about I think it was the lady in the temple.
Oh, sure.
But we can go with you first.
Oh, sure. It actually comes right before it.
Wonderful.
So going back to this issue of, he doesn't talk about the pagan, but this is him talking about, going back to this idea of the Jew and the Christian. He uses the example of Abraham pleading with the Lord for Sodom and Gomorrah to drive his point home of the difference between the Jewish and the Christian. How on the one hand, Abraham's plea for Sodom and Gomorrah was him trying to cover a multitude of sins. But what he does is try to cover over the multitude of sins by asking for 50, 45, 40, 30, 20.
It's a negotiation.
It's a negotiation. It's like, well, can we cover over these sins because of this righteousness? And this leads Kierkegaard to say, and yet what was Abraham himself compared with an apostle? What was his bold confidence compared with an apostle's? And so this idea of like the love that covers all over sins for the apostle isn't the same as trying to find a righteous group of people to cover over the sins of others. it's purely covering over the sins of others. There's less negotiation. So again, this, whether or not this properly represents the real heart of Judaism or not, within Kierkegaard's thought and his religious thought, his theology of religions, we again could call it that, we see these ideas, these comparisons come up again.
It's great you bring that up, because I think that's one thing I think we all confront are these little half measures in trying to really be a loving person. I know Kierkegaard, even in the beginning of this, when he's talking about dwelling on the text, he says, I can't remember where it is, but he said, this is very difficult to dwell on this text, to do it so that in his discourse the one who is speaking does not himself act contrary to the discourse and come to judge others. So there's a sense that we can say, okay, love is this, love is that, and if that person isn't doing it, then they're not righteous.
Yeah, I've already done that while we've been talking. It's not good.
Exactly, no,
it's not good.
But I think that's what we were talking about in the beginning too, of just how simple it is, or how simple a remedy it can seem, but at the same time how difficult and taxing it can be to actually try to do this, because I just did it right now. It's one of those things. So
did you want to talk about the woman in the temple?
Yeah, what's that? I think I read past that passage.
Oh, no,
what do you want to say about that?
I think it was just a nice wrapping up of what Kierkegaard was talking about. I can't exactly remember the story of the woman in the temple. Do you have any recollection, Matt, of the tale in general? I think it was a woman comes into a temple and the Pharisees start yelling at her or something like that.
Oh, this is
the woman
they question
adultery.
her virtue or something, right?
Okay.
It's the woman who was caught in the act of adultery who's brought to the feet of Jesus.
And she weeps at his feet.
She weeps at. He draws in the sand, and that's when he says, "Whoever among you is without sin, cast the first stone."
Okay, so Kierkegaard takes that idea of drawing in the sand, and he compares it to the love is blind or love is deaf sort of thing. And I can't remember where the passage is, but he says, so when he's saying like, okay, why is Jesus writing in the sand? He says, or is he who is writing with his finger on the ground, instead writing in order to erase and forget? There the sinner stood, surrounded by those who were perhaps even more guilty, who loudly accused her. But love stooped down and did not hear the accusation, which vanished into thin air. So this idea that it wasn't necessarily...
And right after that, he says, it wrote with its finger in order to erase what itself knew, because sin discovers a multitude of sins, but love hides a multitude of sins.
This is when he talks about her like weeping herself into perfection.
That might be the third discourse.
Well, I think it all kind of comes together.
Does.
But I believe this particular passage from Luke 7, chapter 7:47. We're jumping around a little bit.
Yeah.
Says her many sins were forgiven her because she loved much, right? Like the sin. We jumped around a little bit, but I mean, this love requires the confrontation of the sin, the humility, the humbling before God. But ultimately, this painful sort of understanding of our own imperfection is what's going to lead to our perfection in Christ. But maybe we should just go ahead and inaugurate the second discourse here. Again, it's called "Love Will Hide a Multitude of Sins," and what's interesting here is that Kierkegaard says that the apostolic how do you say that word? Apostolic speech. I don't know how to say it. Invites the learner to work. It's impatient. It beckons. This love. You've got to go to work right now. And I like this particular quote. It says, "How could anyone have much time for human minutia when he is heading under the full sail of hope toward human perfection?" That's on page 69. So, and then he considers two options that stir up this sort of speech even more. The first is that, when one has given themselves over to love, that like night is over and a new day has begun. Specifically, the quote is the idea that night is over and a day has broken. So now that night is over, we have to make use of that daylight. And the second is that, and maybe Matt, because you have a background in theology, you can speak a little bit more to this, is that like, Jesus spoke about the end being near to some degree, right? Like, my kingdom is at hand. Talk of this stuff. And Kierkegaard is going to talk about how this idea of the end being nigh has a very sobering effect. On page 70, he says, "Therefore the the end of all things is near are not an arid storm cloud that passes over and throws everything into disorder, but an anxiety that clears the air and makes everyone gentler and more deep inward, more loving and swifter to bide the opportune time, but also strong enough not to be exhausted by the thought that the hour of opportunity is past. The apostle who is speaking is not drunk on dreams, but sober in his thinking and in his speech. So this idea that like things are going to get real, like and going to get real quick, is going to require a certain more of self-search, confession, and that embracing that loving attitude, because tomorrow is not guaranteed.
Which I love what he says here on page 70. Therefore, the words, the end of all things is near, are not an arid storm cloud that passes over and throws everything into disorder, but an anxiety that clears the air and makes everyone gentler and more deeply inward, more loving and swifter to bide the opportune time, but also strong enough not to be exhausted by the thought that the hour of opportunity is past.
And I think maybe we should go into that idea of anxiety, because at least when I think of anxiety, I think of, okay, I'm really stressed, but this is a paradoxical, at least to me, a paradoxical sense of anxiety, that it releases stress and then you become more authentic, at least in your relationship towards God or towards yourself. So towards others in general. I'm wondering if we can maybe go into that a little more. I don't know if you had anything pulled up on anxiety in this sense, I suppose.
I mean,
or maybe both of you.
Well, I mean, if we break it down, if we go slow with it, an anxiety that clears the air and makes everyone gentler and more deep inward. I think the anxiety shows sort of the utter meaningless. I think the anxiety is sort of showing that immanent life stages, be they aesthetic, ethical, even what I guess Kierkegaard would call religiousness or whatever, ultimately have a lot of nonsense and rigmarole and meaningless chatter and distraction and diversion built into them. And the fact that like things are radically changing, I think allows us, like when we considered Of the Lilies of the Field and the Birds of the Air, Kierkegaard implored us to study these creations, because they had a better understanding. They were removed from society and they had a better understanding of this radical choice that we have, either to love God or to hate God. And I think also thinking that the end is near clarifies that choice between hating and loving God. It gives us a religious either or.
Well, and it's interesting. So there are two elements here.
And loving God is Christ, because obviously other forms of God worship are going to be inadequate, as we've talked about already with the pagan and the Jewish situation for Kierkegaard.
I think there are two things here that could hang people up. It's funny because they both have negative connotations and people complain about them. But I think Kierkegaard and others give good defense. One is apocalypticism, this idea that the end is near, and how that creates war and violence and whatever. I think Kierkegaard's argument is that actually without it, it would probably create mediocrity. And you have even, what's funny is you have an atheist, like, again, I go back to Zizek, like Slavoj Zizek. He has a positive view of apocalypticism. Like, he sees it as like a positive force for change, and he's like a materialist, an atheist.
Well, there's not time to mess around.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know Zizek that well, but I imagine he views an end times, if it's materially orchestrated, as something to make humanity get its act together to attain a more socially just state. But in this situation, it's to get your house in order for the sake of redemption. And I really like this line from page 70, and we've said it many times already. The apostle who is speaking is not drunk on dreams. A lot of materialists and Marxists say that Christianity is the opiate of the masses, and Kierkegaard is going contra Marx and all of that and saying no, they are awake as a F, right? Like they're woken up as the result of understanding that the end is nigh.
And the other thing, anxiety. So with anxiety, there's this in Kierkegaard's journal. I think it's in the Hong journals. It's the volume 1 and it's selection 100. Deep within every human being, there still lives the anxiety over the possibility of being alone in the world, forgotten by God, overlooked among the millions and millions in this enormous household. One keeps this anxiety at a distance by looking at the many around about who are related to him as kins and friends, but the anxiety is still there, nevertheless, and one hardly dares to think of how he would feel if all this were taken away. So this idea of anxiety, we're not talking about medical anxiety that should be diagnosed and medicated. We're talking about an existential anxiety that's key to being human. In fact, so much so that Kierkegaard says in the same volume in Entry 95 that the greatness of anxiety, the greatness of anxiety is the very profit of the miracle of perfection. And the inability to become anxious is a sign of one's being either an animal or an angel. And ultimately, anxiety pushes one towards guilt consciousness, sin consciousness, and God consciousness. And if you put this, using someone like Heidegger, who's not a Christian, to justify the same point, for Heidegger, anxiety is part of the path toward becoming authentic. It's what makes you aware that, like, you're this, being in the world, you're this Dasein, you're this, and, like, things matter, like, life matters, and it creates this anxiety, drives you towards authenticity.
So this apocalyptic message, then, is this thing to push that anxiety forward and say that, okay, I'm either alone in the world, or like nobody loves me, or God loves me. Like, which is it gonna be? Because if I can love God, then perhaps that anxiety can clear up, and I can actually be in the world.
Yeah. And
fully take it in. That's beautiful.
So what I thought was sort of interesting, that Kierkegaard says, what are we supposed to do with the fact that the end times didn't come? Like,
does he address that?
Yeah. He says, because there's a lot. I don't know. I'm going to defer to you because you know more about the Bible than I do. But all right. but I do recall there are passages, and I'll have to look it up and maybe do some homework. But there are some passages where Christ, I think, may have led the apostles to believe that they would see him again sooner rather than later, or that people alive would be encountering the second coming. Now, I think there are a lot of people that have interpreted those words to be more metaphorically driven or poetic or whatever, so it doesn't look like Christ was just a dude. Right? That he wasn't lying. They kind of stretched the understanding of epoch and divine time and human time and all that stuff. And similarly to how people stretch the understanding of time in Genesis with creation and all of that. But what he says is that the end times didn't come, or at least they didn't come as we think they were supposed to come, as Christ predicted. But he says, has the urgency and meaning of the comforting words gone away? And the way that he gets around that is like, no. Because guess what? You ain't getting out of here alive. Like, it's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the apocalypse comes in your life or not, because the effect is ultimately the same. Like, you're gonna die. Like, you're gonna die one way or the other. It's not like, so there is a personal end time. And maybe Heidegger, I don't know my Heidegger all that well, but I think, Heidegger speaks a lot about being towards death. Does he not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no, that's going to be something that one's subjectivity is going to have to encounter. So whether or not it's ushered in mass, like with horsemen and all the other stuff that are supposed to happen in Revelations or whatever, or it's like a disease that you just can't beat, known as mortality. Like, it's the end time all the same to you. So don't worry about the prediction not coming true.
Sure. And there's this urgency, but at the same time, this patience, I suppose, with love, because Kierkegaard said love is able to live in the same heart in which there is a multitude of sins, and that this love has the power to hide the multitude. So in the sense that love is for the imperfect, for the flawed, it's for us, and that it's not, okay, I'm not worthy of love anymore, I'm going to be, burning in hell when I die or whatever, or something like that. That at any time, love can enter in your life, and God is patient, and he is willing to...
It's like someone wrote a book called Love Wins or something.
I know. Or a poster or something like that, yeah.
Apparently, I love what you said, that love can enter in any time, and because even then, there's a journal entry. I read it in one of the small intros to Kierkegaard. Mm-hmm. There's a journal entry somewhere about Kierkegaard, or something he wrote about, it's potentially universalistic, but like the guy I read it in, who wrote this like intro to Kierkegaard through a university press, didn't cite where he got this quote from.
There's lots of stuff in Kierkegaard that make you think that he's universalistic. I think the thing that's most intriguing is the concept of subjective truth in the Fragments, where he talks about the pagan praying before the idol with all the intensity, and the cultural Christian who has none of the subjective truth, and where does, who's closer? He talks about the pagan being closer. And I think that's a particularly, I don't want to say troubling, but thought-provoking passage. Something I thought was kind of interesting here, just the poetic stuff that Kierkegaard will employ here in this particular second discourse, when he talks about, so every individual is going to die, so everybody's end time, everybody's going to have their own personal judgment day. All right? But he talks about, it's like that, is it Etta James who did Sinner Man? Who did Sinner Man? Ella Fitzgerald? Who did Sinner Man?
I think Nina Simone.
Yeah. Nina Simone did Sinner Man. And it talks about run to the mountains or whatever. Like, it's like, when it's your time, like, you cannot hide from the judgment of God. And, like, your money and this and that will not save you. He says, and Kierkegaard says, the only thing that will endure on your own personal judgment day is the armor of love. That will be the only thing. So the only thing that will save you from that judgment is how well you have loved others and how well you have appropriated the Christian message of love.
So then I suppose we have to talk about how to cultivate, or what's the right way to cultivate that. Because I know Kierkegaard does talk about this idea of focusing perhaps on your perfection or your imperfection of, do I love so much, or do I not love enough? And he says, like, either of those aren't love at all, because he says it takes away from the eye. It's the evil eye, I suppose.
Yeah, your comparison.
Yeah, and I quote a passage. He says, and the person who excludes himself either wants to be happy about himself and not happy about love, or wants to be sad about himself and not happy about love. So there isn't this focus or blindness toward those other things and towards God.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if maybe I don't know if that's the key necessarily, is like not focusing on love and just focusing on God and being reverent to Him.
I think you're doing it right the less you're concerned with it.
Yeah.
So people ask me all the time, like, people say to me all the time, they're like, do you, like, because they know that I'm a Christian, they'll be like, well, do you think I'm going to hell? I'm like, dude, I don't have any time to think about any of that. Like, I'm too busy working on this. Like, I have no conception of your eternal destination, way above my pay grade. You know what I'm saying? I don't know, as someone who speaks to congregations or whatnot, I don't know if you encounter this particular issue in an applied setting.
It sounded like he was going to say something before that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, the issue of hell is a part of eschatology because it does have to do with the end, and I think there's some very interesting issues about hell that I don't want to talk about now because I'm afraid. But page 77, to your point about, like, I loved all these times, or I didn't love. Page 77 has this great quote: "To remember everything is a great thing to the understanding. That love hides a multitude of sins is foolishness to it." So the fact that you're remembering the number of times you loved, or that you did this or that, like, that's part of. In some ways, you almost have to, like, forget rather than remember.
And that's what we were talking about in repetition. This idea of recollection being a negative thing,
if you're recollecting, you are still within the immanent old pagan viewpoint. You need it, but the proper way to relate Christianly is to repeat and to dwell in the moment. And when you're dwelling in that moment, you forget about the future and the past, and you live in the presence of God.
Yes, and this is, again, Bonhoeffer's ethics, and here's probably where you see Kierkegaard and other thinkers coming in here. For him, for Bonhoeffer and Eden, humanity knew God, and out of that they lived their being. But this issue of, like, law and needing to know, like, should we do this now? Should we do this now? Okay, we have to remember the rule. Do we do this now? Do we do this now? Like, that's a sign of separation from the origin.
Yeah, that's what he implores us to do in Of the Lilies of the Field and the Birds of the Air, is that he examines them and says, look how carefree they are. Look how they sing. Look how they blossom. How beautifully adorned they are. They can thrive in the most, like, inhospitable circumstances. Like, lilies can grow out of rock crevices, and birds can just fly over oceans and things like that. And humans who have things set up so much better for themselves often end up being so tortured and dysfunctional and broken. And it's this ability to think forward and backwards all the time. Whereas the lily and the bird are, like, dialed into the harmony of God's sovereign will.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful lesson to take away from that sermon. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, there's something Edenic about obviously there's something Edenic about Adam and Eve. There's something Edenic about nature, but it's almost like when we embrace love as smothering the sin and not seeing it in other people and acting out. It almost feels like we're recapturing something of Eden.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting thing, because I know Kierkegaard says the secret of earthly love is that it bears the mark of God's love, without which it would become silliness or insipid philandering, as if, I guess he's saying, human love were so perfect that it could arouse this anxiety or truly be able to take everything. And perhaps that's anxiety that you were talking about before. That's either love God or be this lonely being in the world.
Which is interesting, though, that the secret of earthly love is that it bears the mark of God's love.
Perhaps the Edenic time you're talking about, maybe?
Yeah, because it's interesting, because there are other discourses where he talks about how God's love, that there's like this break between any form of imminent love, which I would, maybe it's the way Kierkegaard's using earthly, but like in For Self-Examination, Judge for Yourself, in the Pentecost discourse, he talks about how the Spirit gives love, but in order to get that love, we need to die to our immediate sense of immediate earthly love. Okay. And then the Spirit can give the gift of love, which is works of love. It's the you shall love. So it's interesting that he says earthly love bears the mark, but at the same time, like elsewhere, he talks about how there's this separation between the love we naturally feel as humans and the love that God gives.
Do you think maybe it's maybe not a matter of semantics, but do you think maybe Kierkegaard was just using earthly in that contextual situation? And it's just, okay, I just said earthly. I didn't actually mean the earthly I was talking about in works of love or anything else? I
mean, maybe. There are a few moments in these three discourses where Kierkegaard sounds a little bit like a Platonist. And he talks about how like there's love, which is in the earthly love. Later on, he talks about fathers, how there's the father, which comes down into fatherliness. Like, are you a Platonist? Is C. Stephen Evans right? Because I thought he was crazy when he said it.
Yeah. Maybe he was reading these discourses.
Yeah.
We weren't.
I have to apologize to him.
I think there were a couple things I wanted to include here before we went on to the third discourse. We talked about it a little bit. I just thought these were particularly beautiful quotes. CJ mentioned, and we've been talking about how, I think we've been talking about sort of abandoning our conceptions of sort of trying to be morally perfect or to be good enough to meet a certain standard or threshold to get into heaven. On page 74, it says, love takes everything. It takes a person's perfection, and if he wants to clutch it, then love is severe with him. But it also takes his imperfection, his sin, his distress. So I think so. Whatever whatever prideful thing like you have adorned yourself with, it's going to rip it away. Like, for instance, I would say something that maybe I should just speak for myself rather than say like all three of us. But I would say I think I probably would have the tendency to be very much like in love with my ability to have mastery over these texts, right? Or at least fancy myself to have some sort of mastery, to have some sort of intellectual pride or whatever, and to think that maybe I jut out and am some way better than masses of humanity or whatever.
The struggle is real.
Yeah. And, right? Like this is the hell is other people of Sartre or whatever, where you feel like yourself totally individuated. And like the more you cling to that, the more you feel the agonizing pain of sin. And it's when you let that go and understand the absolute equality before God that you actually experience some sort of relief from it. And I like this other page. I don't know if this is, I think I just deleted it accidentally on my iPad, but I think it's from 75. When it was intercepted, all the arrows in its hearts and is wounded by them, it no longer sees them, but sees only love and the blessedness of paradise. Like, it's like when we can let go of our infatuation with ourselves, we can let go of the infatuation with our intelligence, our perfection, or whatever, then like real healing in regards to God can happen. Tears of repentance become tears of adoration. And this harkens back to the woman that was in the temple where she could part with her sin. She sins no more, and she weeps herself into forgiveness. Like what we started talking about this discourse. And I thought that was particularly awesome. I really love this idea of the pain that is then turned into joy as the result of having a religious experience. Because I think people, at least in the cultural Christian scenario, think that it's all like that being a Christian's all like this triumph in the skies, this like glossy-eyed, like delusion. But there is like real sort of penance and repentance and humility that undergoes. It's not just like about like linking hands and rock bands and fog machines and stuff like that. There is like real work that has to be done. It's not some sort of easy sprinkling of water or mass conversion or something like that. And I think what Kierkegaard would particularly have a problem with in our modern day society is how easy it looks to be a Christian now. He saw it in a different way in Copenhagen at the time with baptismal certificates and all sorts of different things that were caught up in the trappings of the Lutheran Church, but they're just kind of reimagined in the American context. I don't know. I mean, maybe you could speak to that at all? I mean, what do you think Kierkegaard would object to in regards to our modern evangelical culture?
I think modern evangelicals baptize conventional American living.
Yes.
Like that's my biggest thing. Is like to be a good Christian means to be a good citizen, a good father, wife, husband, mother, sister, brother.
Not an entrepreneur, so not the self-help meets Christian sort of thing.
Yeah,
I suppose.
It's not a therapeutic deism, I think someone once described it. And it's not, Judge William, I've been reading through Either or Two this summer. Because I need to really finish my master's thesis at Mason. But I've been reading through Either or Two, and there are good things about Either or Two. Like, even in some of these evangelical contexts, like, I've been benefited. Like, there are some of these churches that I've been a part of and I love. If I was in the area, maybe I'd go back. But there's also the reality of, like, bourgeois, middle-class, American culture, nuclear family, 2.5 kids, owning a house, having a successful business. Like, we baptize these things, and there are morally... It's not that you have very morally good people living these conventional lives as Christianly as they can, but let's not... I think per Kierkegaard, let's not confuse that for the religious sphere of existence.
Yeah.
Like, let's acknowledge that, like, that animals can be good parents too.
And it's wonderful you bring that up, because I think that's what he's going to go into in the third discourse when he talks about strengthening your inner being even when you have success or when you have strived through certain terrible things. That you're not... The point is not to glorify all of these riches or the power or the family or the wealth. It's to glorify God first. That, like we've talked about before and Kierkegaard talked about before, you have these gifts, but you're not looking at the gifts. You're looking up at God and giving love and glory to Him.
And there is a type of... he says that if you have these things, you can be strengthened in your inner being by looking at God. Mm-hmm. But back to Luke's point, like, what would Kierkegaard criticize? I think it's the way we too easily relate being a good Christian with being good at these conventional cultural norms, assumptions, ways of life, as opposed to radically thinking about a different way of life. And it's interesting, too, you talk about Danish birth certificates, because, the early church catechesis was like, it was a long process. It was like the catechesis process for early Christians pre-Constantine. Some of those catecheses were like 3 to 5 years, like very long processes of time. I'm trying to think of the book. I think it's by Alan Kreider where he talks about this. But the process of catechesis, to be a disciple and to really change your way of life within a culture versus being baptized into a cultural norm.
So do you think then it's embracing, I think like we'll go into the third discourse, again, embracing the bad and the good at the same time as equal as lessons from the ultimate teacher that is God, I suppose, in some way or another? Or it's not necessarily endorsing... This is the way, like you said, the family and the house and the nice yard and all of that.
Yeah, I'm trying to be cautious because at the same time I realize I could get these things and then I have to deal with and this is why Kierkegaard writes some of his most Christian works under the pseudonym Anticlimacus, because he's like Sickness Unto Death and a few of these, he's like, I thought about writing my own name, but I'm not there. So I'm going to come up with this Anticlimacus fellow who is there. So I recognize that I'm not there, while at the same time living in this comic humorous place of like realizing I'm not there, but kind of wanting to be there, but knowing that like I might not get there and like wrestling with that. But the key is to be awakened to the fact that you're not there, I think, is part of what needs to happen.
That's a great lesson to learn even from the pseudonyms, or just the idea of Kierkegaard using the pseudonyms. It's just almost like a Socratic, I know nothing, but... Yeah, that's one of those things.
You can almost relate to... Sorry, Luke. You can almost relate to Kierkegaard when he talks about there's Johannes Climacus, the humorist. there's Anticlimacus, the religious, and then Kierkegaard's in between. Because, Kierkegaard, sure, he's single, and he eventually thinks that Christians shouldn't get married, and you should just be single like Jesus. But then, but you have this element where he's also a poet of the religious. He's not living it, but he's poetizing it and showing what it would look like. And he's living in privilege. He's not working a job. He's just using his family's fortune to write his authorship, which he feels is a call of God. But there's this intersection of he's doing that, and it's also part of culture. Like, he's not there. And I recognize that I'm not there.
I don't know about you guys. I got there a long time ago. What's the hold up?
But maybe, I don't know if you two, what you two think of this then, but maybe it's just, regardless of where you are, maybe it's not even focusing on the path, but just, I think, like Kierkegaard is saying, just love God. And then not everything else will take care of itself, because that implies that, okay, if I love God, I'll get everything I want, but that...
You have to really love God.
yeah, exactly. At least... 2 or 3-fold, 2 more percent.
It can't be the Diet Cola of loving God.
Yeah, diet God, diet love,
1 calorie, not loving enough.
Well, if
but 0 fat, come on,
Well, if precedent is any indicator of how long it will take us to cover the third discourse, we've got about a half hour left here. So, moving on to the third discourse, which is called Strengthening in the Inner Being. All right, so it starts off with a prayer, and I think. Matt, you might be able to speak a little bit to this. He talks, he extols God for being generous, and we're not to forget the source of generosity. He has this curious statement that even death is not to be feared, for it is a witness to God. I don't know if that's more about, for us trying to understand that death, sobers us up to the reality that we need to get right with God, or that we need to have this sort of appropriate love.
Well, and it's gentle and friendly.
So what do you think he means by that? So that death is a witness to God. How do you understand that?
So, At a Graveside is another discourse and 3 Imagined Occasions. And in that, death... So I wrote an essay about the ways that Kierkegaard uses the idea of, a teacher. What is a teacher? The lilies of the field are teachers. Mm-hmm. So Socrates is a teacher par excellence. Christ is a teacher. But death is a teacher. Mm. So death teaches us to, the psalmist, I believe it's the psalmist says, teach us to count our days. It encourages us to live... I probably actually have it written down in this essay on Heidegger I did, but this idea of it teaches us to count our days, to be concerned about our lives now, to live and act now, to not waste time. And it's something that teaches us, it is a teacher that teaches us how to live life. Not well, but well in the sense of making it count, of living like we should, of pursuing God, loving, all this stuff of what it means to be Christian now.
Yeah.
Death is a teacher for us.
I see.
And so it's a witness to God in that sense of teaching us to be concerned and interested in our life, which is a huge theme in Kierkegaard, being interested in your own self, a self before God. And
yeah.
So death is the teacher that helps get us there.
Cool. Cool. All right, so he begins the third discourse with a reference to Ephesians chapter 3, 13 through the end, or I believe 21. And I believe this is the story of Paul being imprisoned in Rome. Is that correct? So what happens there? He says that that Paul was preaching in captivity. He'd been in prison, but that he was really too much of an outcast to really get the full wrath of Rome. And I guess he was in solitary confinement, but he had a guard. And even in that captivity, he was preaching Christianity. He was enduring the hardship, but he wasn't concerned about himself at all. He was concerned about the congregation back home. And he continued to be a witness even in jail. He was, I guess, in a way, happy in his bondage. He was just concerned for others. If anything, he wanted to make sure that they didn't see him crumble amongst that hardship. And Kierkegaard says on page 83, to transform hardship into a witness for the truth of a teaching, to transform disgrace into glory for oneself and for the believing congregation, to transform the lost cause into a matter of honor that has all-inspiring force of a witness. Is this not like making the cripples walk and the mute speak? And so, and I think this is really wonderful. A lot of people talk about how science has totally eradicated the miraculous and this and that. And I've always had the exact opposite viewpoint of things. I've always seen that science is opening up awe and miracles, and I see them even more. And what I like about what Kierkegaard's saying here is that he sees miracles in places that we don't typically see miracles. He sees this miracle in a prison cell. The fact that Paul was able to have his inner being strengthened by the love of God. So I'm going to stop talking here for a little bit and have you guys sort of say some things about that.
No, I think it's cool that you make reference to that. All I can think of is Martin Luther King in jail and writing the letters from Birmingham jail. So I'm sure he was echoing. I'm sure he echoed Paul in that sense too, since obviously religiously devout and whatnot. But that these miracles can happen from enduring hardship, which we will talk, or which Kierkegaard writes about in these discourses. I think that's really, really neat. I don't know.
So it's interesting here. He talks about to transform the lost cause into a matter of honor on 83. Mm-hmm. I've been trying to delve into Augustine's political writings a little bit. And it's funny because he makes this comment about how...
It's like City of God? Or,
part of the City of God, yeah. It's a compilation of various selections from his political writings. And he makes this interesting point about how a person won't keep fighting when they know they've lost because they'd rather survive and live in slavery to the conqueror than die pointlessly. And I sure hope... I mean, Augustine probably has something different in mind for Christian witness, but it just made me think of how funny it is. Like, I love that Kierkegaard said this, that transforming the lost cause into a matter of honor. Like, not using that utilitarian calculus that's like, yeah, this is... it's probably better to just fail and
it's like die on your shield, die on your shield sort of thing.
Well, maybe, I mean, the martyrdom. Like, well, a lot of the early Christians, like, apparently, like, they sang as they were being devoured by lions or whatever, you know.
And maybe Augustine is just thinking about fighting for any cause other than Christianity, that it's not worth it. It's probably what he's thinking. But I just thought that was great. I also love this idea that Paul appeals to his hardships as a witness to the truth. Like this idea that the more everyone's against you, the more true you probably are.
But there's precedent within the Bible to think this because like it says that those who God tests, God loves. And I mean, look at the examples that Kierkegaard plucks out from the Bible. Job is like the most righteous servant of God, and he is severely tested. Abraham, the father of the faith is severely tested. It's almost like if you're not rebuked by God, on Kierkegaard's view, you're not doing it right.
Well, even someone like Nietzsche, this idea that, I mean, he takes up Kierkegaard's idea of leveling too, that everyone is just made mediocrely the same. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, if you're the one person of strength raising yourself up, you know, and doing something different against the crowd, or like forget the crowd, like be that person, and then try to interpret the world, you know, do the will to power, like interpret the world a certain way, and whoever has the strongest will wins. Like it's not obviously the most Christian view, but in that part about like not being pulled into the crowd and allowing the crowd to define success, winning, correctness, rightness, wrongness, like there's something powerful about that.
And that really emphasizes the radicalness of Christianity that Kierkegaard talks about, that Jesus said the path is narrow. Yeah. That when we were discussing the moment, there's this part where he says, okay, so the Bible said the path was narrow, and Denmark Christendom says the path is wide, that everyone's a Christian, then the New Testament, or what Jesus said, had to be wrong. That there is this adversity that people are going to say, Christianity, what is that? That's so weird, but you have to continue on anyway, even though it's really tough.
I do take some issue with Kierkegaard here on 82. When he says that, I believe he's talking about Paul, who does not forget that higher than saving others is saving one's own soul, subjugating the unruly mind to the obedience of faith, keeping the straying thoughts in the bonds of love by the power of conviction. So the only thing I can think of here, I wanted to say this because in that lovely passage from Romans 9 to 11, that, you know, the big predestination passage that like freaks a bunch of people out and has.
Could you elaborate on that? Because I don't know it.
Basically, that it's the passage where Paul quotes the idea that Esau I've hated, but Jacob I've loved. The idea of God's election,
yes,
and how this sparks all sorts of questions about predestination.
Oh, okay.
And like, does God just hate some people and love others? And like, And there are some interesting things there, which we don't want to talk about here, but Paul does make a comment about the Jewish people and says, I wish I could give up my own soul for them, if I could. So there is this funny thing, like Kierkegaard says this, but like it just put me in mind of that element where he says that, and I just wanted to...
But wasn't Paul... Paul was a Roman. He was Saul.
He was a Jew who had Roman citizenship.
Oh. So I wonder what he means by I would give up my soul for the Jewish people. Like what his conception of the Jewish people is. Because he himself...
all the Jews.
Yeah.
Like the Jews...
Does he not consider himself a Jew?
No, he does.
Yeah.
Like, for the early Christians especially, they don't consider themselves separate from Judaism yet.
No.
So for Paul, he's saying, like, I wish all the Jews would come to faith in Jesus. But the fact that they've rejected Jesus now means that we can bring this message of the Jewish Messiah to you Gentiles. And don't be boastful, because like God still wants the Jews to have faith in Christ as well. So and if they were to embrace Christ, like the whole world could potentially be saved then. Like, but now that they're not, it allows us to go to you to talk about this. And it's
like, so is it kind of like well, we gave it to the Jews first, but they're not interested in it, so now everybody else can have it. They had first shot, but now it's
they killed him, and now
no.
Oh, sorry.
Not saying that
at all.
Reverse.
No.
The
Romans killed
The
Jesus
Romans,
Christ.
yes, sorry.
Yeah, with a cabal of leaders who were probably concerned about fomenting revolution and incurring the wrath of Rome. I mean, a lot of that. There were some issues in first century.
It's a complicated. It was complicated. There were Jewish priests, and then there was the Roman polity that both had an interest in Jesus being put down.
Yeah.
But they're not. I don't have to get into all that.
The biggest issue is that like. I wanted to address that, and obviously we could probably do a whole thing on. I mean, the philosophy of election. We could probably talk about Levinas and like get into all sorts of issues of election and how that relates to violence or peace, and do all that another day. But in this case, just this idea. This is the biggest issue I might have with Kierkegaard, is this problem of community versus the individual, and how there are elements where I think the emphasis on community within Scripture gets overlooked by Kierkegaard he's writing in a particular time and place, but this is one of those where I had to see this and go, this is one of those spots where I don't think you've taken into account that Paul says this about the Jewish people.
Yeah. Well, man, okay. The other thing, I think the thing that we have to like spend like time closing out this session with is trying to understand how adversity and prosperity relate to the inward strengthening.
Yeah. Okay.
So if we move past like page 82, and we're getting into the mid high 80s towards the end, Kierkegaard seems to be profoundly interested in people that are prosperous in the ways of the world, those that don't encounter any sort of gifts from the world, and what this ultimately means. Let me just see if a quote can kind of get us going here. From page 86, he says, not until the moment when there awakens in his soul a concern about what meaning the world has for him and he for the world, about what meaning everything within him by which he himself belongs to the world has for him and he therein for the world, only then does the inner being announce its presence in this concern. So what seems to be the case here is that if you are successful, I'm trying to understand this, and maybe this other quote will help us too from 86, 87, just to get us going. How indeed would a person through his knowledge be sure that his prosperity is God's grace, so that he dares to rejoice in it, and safely devote himself to it, or that is God's wrath and is only deceitfully hiding the abyss of perdition from him, so that his downfall might be all the more terrible. So I guess what he's trying to say here is that there's a very real anxiety that comes with temporal success. Yeah. Like because we know about these different stories from the Bible about individuals that were sort of anointed and blessed by God. Like, is this really just lulling us into a false sense of security before it's all ripped away from us? That we have fortune and chance like utterly destroy it. If we don't believe in a higher power, we believe like maybe this just came about by fortune and chance, and we're restless at night that it could leave us again. But it's ultimately going to be the fact that like when we reach out to God through love, when we do have that Christian love or whatever, regardless of whether or not we have fortune or we lose fortune, everything is made sense of.
Yeah.
Right? Like that everything becomes sane and rational when we have truly woven our being into the love of God. Is that kind of how you understand it, or how you guys understand this?
Well, I love this issue of concern because, again, we go back to this idea of passionate interestedness in yourself. Like a self that engages in the world, makes choices. Per reading Either or Two again, this concern is not calmed by more detailed or more comprehensive knowledge. And it talks elsewhere, 87, he talks about the problem of some explanations being equivocal. So there are types of explanation, like we all want to engage in the world, we want to know how, but he talks about, having an explanation. And then he says, but it's not an explanation where we could explain it. It's not like Kant's antinomy of reason, where you could explain it one way or the other, and you're still left not knowing. No. Like this is either or. Judge William talks about how you can deliberate forever and ever and never come to a choice.
Yeah.
But the key is of a different kind, where knowledge is transformed into action, which requires a different witness, which is faith, which allows you to stop the process of deliberation and to be strengthened in your inner being.
Right, because if you may think that like all these riches and all these things that you have achieved or whatever may be some sort of external demonstration that you're favored by God or whatever, but it very well could be a deception.
Yeah.
It's just like the story Kierkegaard alludes to in the Bible of the parable of the rich man who gets all of these fields and then he gets all the grain and he builds bigger bigger mills for his plunder and all of that, and then suddenly one night God says, he calls upon his soul, or I guess to be taken up into heaven, and the rich man, freaks out, and I think Kierkegaard alludes to the fact where he says the rich man doesn't even know a soul. What do you mean? That he was focusing on these outwardly things, and not necessarily focusing on the inward self or the relationship with God and whatnot.
87, there's this... Sorry, Luke.
No, please.
There's this great quote, and he said, in this concern, the concern we talked about earlier that's awakened, the concern for the self, the inner being announces itself, the inner being that is concerned not about the whole world, but only about God and about itself, about the explanation that makes the relation understandable to it, and about the witness that confirms it in the relation. At no moment does this concern cease. The knowledge gained is not an indifferent knowledge. So again, there are explanations and there's a type of comprehensive knowledge and explanation that is, it's deliberation, it's speculation. It's the very thing Kierkegaard is addressing when he confronts certain forms of Hegelianism. But there's a different type of knowledge that is not indifferent, because reason within German idealism, for Kant, reason is indifferent to who you are as an individual. So you have these antinomies of reason that can explain either way. In German idealism, objective knowledge is indifferent to who you are as an existing individual. But there's a type of knowledge where God knows the individual that is not indifferent to who you are as an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that's the really radical thing about Kierkegaard. And I think why so many people are drawn to him is that that knowledge can be particularized, right? And it's a knowledge that really can't be made public, as we've seen it's a thing that we've talked about in so many different works of Kierkegaard's, right? That ultimately this is an understanding, a subjective understanding between the individual and God. And going back about this understanding between the individual and God, and in regards to prosperity, I really love this idea because it conjured up images of those cheesy images of where Jesus is helping you hit a home run, like in the baseball scene or whatever.
Jesus in the park, yeah.
like where Jesus is helping you out when you're doing stuff. But I think this is a more authentic way of sort of talking about it. Kierkegaard says something to the effect that the man who prospers and knows God as the source of his prosperity rests well and has no problem handing his soul to God. He rejoices in it. And what I thought was pretty interesting on page 91, he says, longs even more for the moment when he with his God will rejoice that they succeeded. It's almost like giving God a high five.
Touchdown Jesus?
Yeah, it's almost like touchdown Jesus, that the person that has properly appropriated Christian love or whatever has developed the subjective relationship and understanding of the knowledge of God and vice versa, right? Where God and the individual know each other.
That reminds me of
the prosperity doesn't matter so much. It's something that God and you do in tandem, and you don't even care.
Of how Johann Sebastian Bach would always sign his pieces for the glory of God. So, and no matter what virtuosity he showed or what musical prowess, it was just him and God there. So I think that's a really...
I love this on 88. I agree. I just realized that I was catching you at the end, but I was
fine.
I was trying to beat Luke to it. I was like, no, but one more thing.
No, go on. What did you going to say?
Top of 88. But God is spirit, and therefore can give witness only in the spirit. It is in the inner being. Any external witness from God, if such a thing could be thought of, can just as well be a deception. So again, this idea that the external witness of prosperity isn't the thing, or even comprehensive knowledge, any of these things, these objective facts we can line up, but it's the inner witness of God to the inner being of the human being.
So do you think that goes back to the first discourse where it's just like, don't focus on the gift, just focus all your attention on God, I suppose?
That is the gift.
Yeah,
God is the gift.
Yeah,
So like for instance right now, like whatever happens with Noetic, right? Like let's let Noetic toils in obscurity, or we toil in obscurity, or it becomes something, this thing that people get really fanatical about. It doesn't matter, because so long as and I think this would be really good to focus on the purity of hearts to will one thing. By the way, a friend of mine, Robert Schutt, just did a great overview of that text, and I highly recommend everybody checking it out. But the ultimate sort of gift and the thing to be celebrated is that God is in the mix, regardless of what outcome obtains. Could
I quote Kierkegaard?
Yeah, please
to continue
do.
That he said, God gives not only the gifts but himself with them in a way beyond the capability of any human being.
Yes, which himself with them. This goes to practice in Christianity, where he says that the helper is the help. In other places, the physician gives help, but the physician is not the help.
Yeah.
In the case of Christianity, Jesus is the helper who is the help.
Yeah. And that idea is repeated also in the philosophical fragments, where he is unlike the Socratic teacher, whereas the Socratic teacher, the teacher doesn't matter. It's the teaching, the doctrine that matters. Yeah. Whereas with Christ as the teacher, he matters, and everything else doesn't really matter. It's Christ as the person matters, because that's ultimately where the breaking of the self and the new self before God occurs, which is a pretty awesome thing. Okay, what about adversity? We talked about the man that is prosperous, but what about the one that encounters adversity and is unfortunate? Anybody want to say anything about that?
As in, what are they lacking?
Well, they so what do we? That might be all fine and good to the people that are wildly successful. Mm-hmm. But if you were Paul and you're in the jail cell and you're experiencing adversity, or if your life endeavors don't amount to what you calculated them to be, if you didn't reap enough from what you sowed, or your ambition couldn't keep up with your dreams, or whatever else, it doesn't really matter, because like everything else, you're sort of resting with God. And this quote from page 95: "Then little by little he became lighter and lighter. He gradually threw overboard the worldly weight of earthly desires and rested with the witness in God, blessed by the hope he had won." So ultimately, whether you're prosperous or have adversity, the outcome is ultimately the same, so much as you appropriate and reach out to God. The external circumstances don't matter. So there's no envy to be had of the prosperous man, because ultimately you have the same gift given to you, which is God.
And I think it goes back to what we were alluding to with the graveside text about death being a friend. Kierkegaard says of the man in distress, he nevertheless did find an explanation of, why am I suffering, such and such. That God was testing him. The trial and the tribulations, became for him a confidant, a friend in disguise, even though he did not comprehend how. So it's odd, because that last point gives me the idea that sometimes we can't, even if we say, okay, this is a trial and God is there for me or he loves me, there is still this idea that you don't really know what's going on, almost like an Abraham, where he's not really sure that, okay, I'm not going to kill my son, I'm going to be completely cool and everything. There's still this, okay, I got to do this, even though how insane it is. I don't know.
Yeah, and even though Abraham had everything, and then it was taken away, and then it was given back, and all of that, I mean, there was constancy in Abraham's life. Mm-hmm. You know, he didn't waver in the relationship with God. That's why he is the father of the faith, mm-hmm. and he is to be one that we are to imitate.
Yeah. And I love how it says, he possessed nothing but a burial place in Canaan, yet he was God's chosen one.
Yep.
195.
Yeah.
After this idea that adversity was the best instructor.
Yeah. Well, why is adversity the best instructor? Because not unlike death, right? It causes you to concentrate on what's really the most meaningful thing. I think other places that Kierkegaard has talked about how, like, I don't know, maybe it was in Sickness Unto Death, where he talks about despair being a blessing.
Yeah.
That ultimately these are the things that grow us closer to God, that cause us to make the existential commitments. It's actually worse in some ways on the Christian view, the Kierkegaardian view, for everything to be perfect for you. Yeah. If you are born with beauty, if you're born with all the intelligence, if you're born with fortunes, if you're born with all of this, like, where's the adversity? Where's the struggle for you to actually meet God and for him to meet you halfway? Like, it just gets to a point where you're just totally obsessed with yourself.
Yeah.
And so as long as you're obsessed with yourself and not focusing on God, you're apart from God. So eternally, all these things that are prosperous gifts are actually could be the road to perdition.
Do you think it's as black and white as that? I know Kierkegaard at least implies at the end that everything, the good, the bad, or I guess to quote him, for the inner being, joy and sorrow, good and bad fortune, distress and victory are gifts. For it, the giver is primary giver.
Yeah, he says if romantic love is frustrated, then God's love is found.
So even if somebody did have a wonderful life, per se, could they still, even if they didn't maybe encounter that much hardship, could they still, in a sense, say, okay, why do I have this? What did this come from? And that they could either say, like, okay, it's all from me because I'm the best, or they could say, well, it's God and I have to give my glory to him, that my life is so beautiful. That maybe hardship isn't, number one, and then, good stuff is number two, in the sense of how we...
I think he thinks that there's something inevitable about the teleology of the human spirit, that regardless of where you are in life, like where you get thrown into this world, that like hardship and despair will find you. I think he talks about there being a particular sort of restlessness that occurs as the result of having so much prosperity.
The anxiety you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, think about it. I mean, we live in an area that is very bourgeois or whatnot, but is totally plagued by misery and unrest. I mean, I can't divulge any sort of secrets, but I know many people who are quite well off, who do many, many things to anesthetize themselves to the despair that they find in their lives.
Thank you for mentioning that, because, I mean, even if somebody can say, oh, my life's wonderful, there's still this thing behind you, this anxiety.
Do you want to talk about that real quick before we...
Sure, can you read it?
I can't see it.
Yeah.
I know this is something you brought up, and I think it would be good if you have some thoughts on this written down. Page 97. The person who loves God is strengthened in the inner being. And the person who loved people, and only through this love learned, as it were, to love God, has had only an imperfect upbringing. But the person who loved God, and in this love learned to love people, was strengthened in the inner being.
We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah,
about the sense of having success and then saying, or just trying to take the American dream and trying to mold that onto a Christian life or something like that, maybe. Without starting with God and then...
Well, I think even social justice-y stuff. Like this idea that, like, I've had friends who've been burned in the personalism of evangelicalism, the personal view of God. And so then they but we need to focus on loving your neighbor. It's equal to love of God. And so they move away from what they see as, we called it therapeutic deism, emotionalism, whatever. And they move to this place of public social concern, which I think is important, but they do so... It's like love of neighbor and social justice stands in for any what Kierkegaard would call inwardness. There isn't the inwardness with God that gives that the weight it should have. Or it makes everything backward, that you're loving people and then kind of adding God to it, versus having an inward love of God that you can't quantify, others can't see, but that nevertheless affects your love of people.
People are mediating your relationship with God. They're actually getting in the way of it. Whereas I think we talked about this. I can't remember where we talked about it last, but there's sort of this triangulation effect that if God is sort of the middle term, then you can have the inward deepening and love people simultaneously.
Okay, so I don't want to try to botch this, but is it almost like a Aristotelian golden mean where maybe like we have like the one side which is okay, I'm just gonna love myself and everything's great, maybe the other side where it's like social justice all the way, woohoo, but then there's this middle where God is present, or maybe that's not an entirely.
I think you could think about it that way. I think you
If
could
it helps
think
you
about it that
understand.
way.
It feels like it's kind of botching the idea where maybe it's focused completely on God, which isn't exactly in the middle. I mean, like Kierkegaard would say, it's the most radical thing you could
But
probably
if
do.
I think Kierkegaard would say, if you are loving God, you're loving yourself and you are loving people. Because if you love God, you're ultimately bestowing yourself with inward strength, right? So therefore, you have given yourself the greatest gift by having a relationship with God, and there is an overflowing of love from the fact that you've been redeemed and have been saved from your sins. That love that has been smothered or whatever, I think you sort of reflect back out to humanity. So you can have it all as a result of making God the loci of your being. I mean, how would you? You don't have to. I don't feel like when you are choosing to love God, you are choosing yourself or people. You get to have God, yourself, and people.
Yeah, I feel like the problem with the Aristotelian example is like, it's like, don't love God too much.
That's all I could think of too. I was just like, wait, where it's like, love God just right. Where we were denying that too. Where it's like, oh, let me find 50 righteous people. Let me do 20 righteous things. Let me love people, 20 times out of 30 in the day, and I will be totally fine. That it has to be this radical, no balance. We're not balancing. We're just like throwing away the scale, or I guess
It's an unconditional commitment, because then to calculate or whatever, then we're doing that thing that Abraham was doing about negotiating with God.
We just throw over the scales and the tables like Jesus did, with the money lenders or whatever. He's just like, just get out.
That's an interesting way to reinterpret that. I hadn't thought about it like that, but there is something.
If you're going to be like Derrida, then it's just a reading. Every reading is just a reading. It's just a bunch of signifiers, man. It's just the words, and then
let's make it semiotic. I'm not even.
There's no signify. There's no ultimate authorial intent we should look for. It's just the signifiers, man. It's cool. It's the words. It's.
Wasn't that what Kierkegaard started out? I guess that's what Kierkegaard was saying, was that we should focus on the word, but the apostolic words that they're bestowed upon by God, and that an apostle said it, rather than just like, oh, they're poetic, aren't they nice? Like somebody said this. I don't know.
Well, guys, we're at an hour and a half. I think I think that we covered these 3 upbuilding discourses at a pretty good clip. I don't have anything else to say. Matt, as our super guest, do you want to close out with anything? You good? Everybody feel good about it? All right, we'll powwow and figure out what we're going to do next time. I really like the chemistry of this. We should do it again. All right, cool. See you guys.
Bye.